Architecture, A Guide for the Perplexed, which is a recently published book by Tom Heath. And tonight we have with us here this evening, we have somebody who probably, for many of you, I've seen you chatting to him earlier, probably needs no introduction. We have Professor Gordon Holden, who's the current Head of Architecture at Griffith University, and I'm also happy to say he previously was actually Head of Architecture School of Design here at Queensland University of Technology, and was just telling me earlier that he was actually involved with the implementation of the Art Museum here. So we opened that 10 years ago. So pleasure to have you back.
Thank you.
So I will hand things over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for coming. It's a challenge to compete against certain other events on this evening, I'm sure. But as you know, this has been billed as what you see on the screen: Learning Architecture, Teaching Architecture, A Guide for the Perplexed, Tom Heath, public lecture. Well, that's not what my public lecture is going to be about. So I'm going to give you a new title. And the retitle is, it's about Tom Heath, a life of guiding the perplexed. And I'm going to look at his practice, his communications of architecture, and his teaching. And inevitably, we'll come back to the recently published book a little bit later in the evening. So, to introduce Tom, I'm going to introduce his parents. His mother, Ella Catherine Merriweather Busby, and father, Dr. Leo Barclay Heath. His mother came from a very distinguished family, and a little bit more about that shortly, and his father, a very distinguished surgeon in Sydney, and I understand a very reserved and quiet person. I think we can say that Tom was born into a high upper middle class family, and with connections to very important historical figures in Australia's history. In searching through to trace Tom's lineage, some of my notes there that aren't intended to be read, they were simply trying to find out who connected to where in his ancestry. But it was revealed, and I'm using the term, a touch of aristocracy. Tom's great uncle on his mother's side, through his grandmother, was David Scott Mitchell, who willed a collection to establish the Mitchell Library in Sydney, primarily as a depository for Australian history. And Tom's great-great-uncle on his mother's side, through the grandfather, was James Busby. And we discover that Busby wrote the Treaty of Waitangi, which is the peace treaty between the British at the time and the Maori in New Zealand. Unlike Australia, where there is no treaty, there is in New Zealand. Busby also is known for the Busby collection of grapevines from France, Spain and England, which established Australia's first wine industry. Busby brought the cuttings to Sydney, where they were planted out, they were nurtured, they were later transplanted to vineyards in the Hunter region, the Kirkland vineyard, that eventually became Lindeman Wines. And further back, the Busbys were descendants of the Earl of Cassilis in Scotland. I doubt anybody here would have understood that. Perhaps even C. Penn may not have known. And other members of the Busby clan the father, John, contributed significantly to establishing reliable water supply for Sydney for nearly half a century. Another brother was a member of the New South Wales Legislative Assembly, and I heard anecdotally that yet another brother brought the first steam engine to Australia. So there was a lot going on, and I'm quite sure growing up Tom would have heard about this from his mother. I think he received his middle names of Frederick William Merriweather after his mother's brother, who was killed in the First World War. That was the deceased uncle's name. A little about David Scott Mitchell. Mitchell was born in Sydney, and he was a very conservative person. I want you to remember these words. He was of spare build and delicate constitution, although having nothing of doctors. He was reserved and modest. He was a good conversationalist with a touch of wit and humour. He remained unmarried and lived meagrely and unostentatiously in a comfortless house, declining honours and any infringement of his privacy. Although he inherited considerable land in the Hunter Valley, together with wealth, he had a name for parsimony, except in his collecting, where he spent liberally, but with the collector's ethic that had no place for sentiment. Mitchell died in 1907 and bequeathed the library his entire collection with an endowment of £70,000. The mind boggles at what that might translate to these days. Probably enough to build the building. Despite his fine memory and erudition, he wrote nothing and left his one main memorial, the Mitchell Library, with 60,000 volumes, mostly Australian historical collections. The Mitchell Library is the heritage of Tom Heath's family. A snippet I stumbled upon. Now, there's more. Admiring one of Tom's books in his office one day, hoping that I might borrow it, he said that he did not loan out books. He explained that the reason was that after loaning a diary that he had inherited to the Mitchell Library, I recall that he mentioned it was one of Sir Joseph Banks's diaries. He was told sometime later that they had lost it. So Tom never loaned another book. At the time, I thought that Tom must have been a descendant of Sir Joseph Banks. But in my research, I discovered that it was his great uncle, David Scott Mitchell, who was the collector. And indeed, there probably were other of Banks's diaries that Mitchell had collected. Banks had numerous diaries. He was at sea for 2.5 years with Cook, and one diary, one single volume wouldn't have sufficed. So I am surmising that this diary has come down through his great uncle, whilst other diaries, this one that's illustrated, is in the Mitchell Library. The other one is lost. Maybe there are others again, I'm not sure. I've not seen this in the Mitchell Library, but I understand from my readings it is considered to be one of their great treasures. Tom attended Cranbrook School in Sydney, from where he graduated in 1948 with the Holmes Court Memorial Prize for Top Boy. The Cranbrook headmaster, Brian Hone, wrote to Dr. Holmes Court. explaining the background to the choice of Tom as top boy. And he wrote as follows: Heath is one of the best scholars that we have ever had in this school, a most able boy. He has shown exceptional qualities of moral courage and ideals of service over the past few years. He is a poor physique, yet by sheer determination and courage forced his way into the third 15 football team during the football season and set an example to anyone who liked to consider themselves a pure intellectual by his fire and robustness. When I passed this by one of Tom's teachers last week, he said, that sounds like a bit of a stretch to me. Perhaps it was the fifth 15, not the third. Nevertheless, this is what was written. The headmaster goes on. He has been editor of the Cranbookian, the school magazine, and head librarian and warrant officer first class in the cadets. And in these positions, he has shown outstanding qualities of leadership. He finishes off, Heath is going to Paul's and is going to do architecture. Clearly, Tom showed high intellectual abilities at school, where he was introduced to architecture, to logic and philosophy by his English and history teacher, Mr. Harry Nicholson, who I had the pleasure of sitting next to at dinner last week, as I made copious notes during the conversation. Clearly, this grounding underpinned Tom's life work. Now, Tom owned a definitive collection of Buck Rogers and Phantom comics, which he started collecting as a boy. I never saw them myself, and I don't recall that he ever talked about them. It was surmised by Harry Nicholson that comics and science fiction were probably Tom's escape mechanism from parents who were very serious and quiet, perhaps. There's a quick summary here of Tom's architectural education, key dates and so forth. I won't go through that other than to add some dimensions that on graduating in 1954, he won the Board of Architects Prize for Best Performance in the degree. And then on graduating with the Master of Building Science, he gained the Building Science Prize and the Institute of Architects New South Wales Chapter Prize. He was the principal of McConnell, Smith and Johnson, a very influential firm, and remained so, but especially in those earlier days. And during this period, he lectured in theory at the University of Sydney. And in 1972, he received the Institute of Architects Copper Industry Scholarship. This allowed him to spend some time researching a topic which I'll come to a little bit later. He was a member of the Craft Board of Australia Council from 1973 to 77. He joined QUT in 1979. I joined QUT in 1978. And as it was then, I'm not sure if it continues, in the interview panel at the time, there was a position called elected staff representative, and that ended up being me. So I was there at the ground floor of Tom's appointment to QIT, as it was at the time. He served as University Research Professor of Design from 1991 until 95, when he retired. He was a Life Fellow of the RAIA member of the Australian Academy of Science, Fellow Design of the Design Institute of Australia, Fellow of Royal Society of Arts, a founding member of the Environment and Design Research Association. I want to show you now a small number, 5, of the buildings that Tom contributed to. The firm of McConnell, Smith and Johnson, noted for very responsible, rational architecture. They placed high value on design and documentation, on teamwork, and thorough research into environmental and user determinants that provided the basis for solutions. I'm indebted to Jennifer Taylor for this knowledge from her book, Australian Architecture Since 1960. This was a firm that suited Tom's values and approach to architecture that became even more clear through his later writings and teachings. Tom and a close colleague at MSJ, John Wyndham, who I also had the privilege of meeting last week, coined the Heath-Wyndham assertion, which goes something like, a good building has to either look good or make sense. A great building must do both. I'm indebted to John last week for that little quote. Tom was portrayed in the firm's promotional literature as having especially interested in high technology buildings. And in addition to the selection that I'm going to show you, he was involved in other buildings, including other hospitals, colleges, historical restoration, and a research centre that I'm aware of. This first building, the Sydney Water Board building, I remember it as a student as one of the great buildings of Australia that inspired a lot of us. It broke new ground in providing facade treatment to control sun penetration for different orientations. It wasn't normal for office buildings. They would be much the same on all sides. But this one recognised the different sun penetration angles for different orientations and responded. The technically advanced design adopted precast concrete floors, stairs and walls, and Sydney sandstone coloured spandrel panels fixed to very wide span steel framing the entire width of the building, which allowed for open planning. The building was highly influential on future work in Sydney. Its responsiveness to climate and place, with its sensitive colours blending into Sydney, were characteristics that paralleled the emerging Sydney regional style of domestic architecture. This is Tom's own house in Woollahra, 1969. It was published in Architecture Australia. The design is of what we now refer to as the Sydney regional style, a style that was influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright and the arts and craft movement, Japanese architecture, and to some extent by Le Corbusier. Characteristics of Tom's house, in common with the Sydney style, are split levels, fitted to the steep slope, carefully contrived, complex interiors that are also relaxed and informal. Textural and tactile qualities of materials with painted brick walls and stained rough sawn timbers. The Thine building was a new, a new residential wing of St Andrew's College at the University of Sydney, a men's residential college. The rooms are arranged in groups of 4 to provide occupant territories. Careful attention was given to noise control from the car park, kitchens and service and access areas through grouping these areas away from the student rooms. The student rooms faced northeast and provided with balconies and sun shading. Tom had a large role in this building. I'm indebted to Louise Cox for some of this more detailed appreciation of the work during this period. The law courts in Sydney. The firm's thorough research into functional and human needs is evident in the law courts building. Simplicity of the building is enlivened by the patterns of the cladding units placed not only in accordance with orientation of the facade, but also with respect to the various functions, such as courtrooms needing minimal openings. Respectful urban design is evident at street level, where the facade and entrance are set back to provide a sheltered colonnade that reduces crowding and provides space adjacent to the nearby historic buildings. The Royal Prince Alfred Hospital redevelopment, which took quite a period of time, about 10 years. The image on the right shows a more recent building in the foreground with the circular glass element. It's the building behind that that Tom had a lot of involvement in. This was a major project for MSJ. It set new standards for collaboration between the Government Architect's Office and private consulting firm. This collaboration was quite an innovation. It was being tested in a sense. Up until then, the Government Architect's offices did their own work and it was public work. There were very few collaborations and this set new standards. Tom oversaw the first stage of the complex project, also writing the specification and observing the work. Louise Cox was the on-site architect, and she worked very closely with Tom and was grateful for his permission for her to remain as the site architect whilst pregnant, though she did say that she nearly gave birth on site. This is quite an early energy-conscious building. Double glazing, window shading, careful attention to the control that's needed, that's coming back into attention in design in more recent times. A little on leadership now. During his deanship, Tom initiated two important new disciplines: interior design and urban design. And I was privileged to have the responsibility for preparing the documentation and leading both of them at their inception. Tom encouraged, initiated and supported exhibitions. And he used his strong connections in the professional and art worlds to help advance the faculty. He disliked formal meetings and ensured that they ran to the shortest possible time. I recall that after he joined QUT, the end-of-year examiners meetings, which until then took up to 2 days, suddenly were able to be completed within a day. I'm not sure what they take these days, if they happen at all. He had no time for bureaucracy and delegated as much of that sort of work as he could. He regularly wrote about bureaucracy, even trying to understand how to deal with the worst of it. Though he did say to me once, when I was frustrated in trying to streamline some course of action or another, words to the effect, bureaucracy is like a bottomless swamp that you can never drain. He was a very strong supporter of the QUT Colloquium series and provided many ideas for topics as well as suggestions for speakers. He gave papers or chaired sessions for the colloquiums and flew the flag in many places to garner support. You may be wondering what the funny image is on the left. Well, the students made a life-size effigy of a clown and dragged it around for a while. It attended classes and gathered with its other students in the foyer and so forth. Tom took a shine to the clown, and it ended up in his office for some time. I attended several meetings with Tom, other colleagues, and the clown, who, whilst remaining silent, somehow seemed to usefully contribute. Idiosyncrasies. We all have them. Just a few of Tom's. Computers. He hated them. Vowed he would never use one. I think he toughed it out. Unless somehow he secretly tried one, I don't know. Tom took snuff. He selectively offered it to others. We saw a graffiti, it was in the A block toilets, which said, "Tom Heath makes sandcastles in his snuff box." And somebody must have photographed that and submitted it to a book on Australian graffiti because it was published in the mid-80s. Tom had something about phones. He hated them too. He also had something about physical activities and the outdoors. He was not a great supporter of student field trips, especially if they involved camping, which he said, the thought of which made him break into a cold sweat. Tom was shy, interpreted by some as aloofness. Tom asked me one day how he could communicate better with others. I suggested that he leave his office door open and that he walk around the school for opportunistic meetings with colleagues and students. And he did try that for a while. Tom was thought to have numerous identical fawn-coloured suits. I've heard up to 6 or 8 of them, which meant that he didn't have to worry about what to wear each day, only to decide which of the multitude of bow ties he would wear. I never saw Tom without a bow tie, even when I visited his home, with CPEN's home. I'm sure he must have taken them off. The colloquium. In the this is the only photo I could find, and there are a few recognisable faces there. The late myself on the left, in the back, the late Jim Woolley, Spence Jamieson, yours truly, Professor Andrew Seidel, who's with us, Tom, Kenneth Yang in the front, the late Paula Whitman, and Ron Lucock, who's currently a visiting academic at the University of Queensland from Georgia Tech. In the '94 Winter Colloquium, which was titled Architectural and Urban Design Theory for the 90s, I recall that in his conference summary, Neville Quarry said about virtual reality that a more accurate term would be actual fantasy. Tom nodded animatedly, strongly agreeing with this. And the question in my mind is, what might both Tom and Neville have to say about morphing, let alone Twitter? Teaching. Tom had a significant influence on academics at QUT. He laid solid intellectual foundations for the cultural challenge from a craft apprenticeship-based approach to education to a research-based one. While not everybody agreed with his strong position on some matters, very many are indebted to him for the discourse he provided, which bridged the arts and the sciences. He showed the abundant potential when each field informed the other. He elevated the expectations of scholarship in teaching and the profession through his research, writing, and lectures. he initiated the design theory course, many aspects of which flow over into this final book that we're celebrating. His lecture notes continue to be referred to, exemplified by a current PhD student, Rayleigh Burns, who is with us this evening. Her research and publication related to designing learning spaces has used Tom's VAST heuristic for gathering data and understanding. VAST is V for values, A for activities, S for site and systems, and T for technology. Tom was an idealist regarding theory and method in architecture. He believed that if only we could develop the right theories and methods, and if everybody followed them, then we would produce an excellent built environment. He attempted to build this into his and our teaching, with students going through strict stages of information and data collection, prioritization, and conceptual designing. However, he found that most students were good at the collection and ordering phases, but this did not reliably flow through to good designs. I suggested to him that not everybody had the same thinking process, and that for some, an intuitive idea might be as good a starting point that could subsequently be tested. He seemed uncomfortable with this, but he reflected, and he later acknowledged that the point had some merit in one of his writings. Tom was the supervisor of QUT's architecture discipline first PhD graduates, Noma Kumasaria, who's with us this evening, and Mary Gannis, and there were others who came later. We know Tom produced 3 books. Taking them in turn, Method in Architecture. Some thoughts. In the preface, Tom declared he once believed, like most practicing architects, that the design of buildings was a process of exploration and discovery, which each time followed a different path and revealed something entirely new. This was challenged when he later discovered the analogy between problem-solving methods and the design process that he'd been using in practice. And this book, Method in Architecture, is his explanation of interactions between theory and practice from the position of a structured approach to designing. This book seems to not have had the impact that Tom might have hoped, possibly because of several reasons, including its apparent density. When flipping the pages, it's rather overwhelming. Its inclusion of flowcharts that are visually confronting. There's one there, top right for you. The title, Method, which implies certainty. And the scarcity of illustrations, though there are some. Collectively, which I suspect frightened off potential readership amongst architects. Actually, the book's not that scary, and it does include very helpful design discussion, sensitive to architectural creativity. The bottom 2 images can give you some clues about that. It remains a valuable contribution to architectural knowledge, in my view. What, if anything, is an architect? Widely taken up by the profession, perhaps because of the quick grab, easy read and humorous cartoons. This collection of 54 essays derived from a decade of editorials in Architecture Australia, the 1980s. Bruce Angle's cartoons by Geoffrey Atherton aptly capture many pertinent ethical, aesthetic and practical issues of the profession in support of the articles. By my reading, Tom was at his best when addressing philosophical and aesthetic matters, but all of the articles are a good read. Neville Quarry, in the foreword to this book, felt that the writings could be grouped under the headings of demolition, excavation, and construction of architectural beliefs and theories. If we accept Quarry's groupings, then I think Tom's new book squarely sits as a construction. Although there is also some demolition of what he considers to be false beliefs, and Tom couldn't help himself with that, I'm sure. Learning Architecture, Teaching Architecture, a guide for the perplexed. Perhaps many of you have read it already. I'm still working my way through. This book provides primary knowledge to the student of architecture that directly addresses buildings and their embodied architectural ideas, combined with added dimensions of down-to-earth information and advice on how to apply knowledge. Although there will, no doubt, be different views held from Tom's about learning and teaching, I think the reader of this book will find that there's no nonsense in it. Amos Rappaport, in his preface, has said, it was clear that anything Tom said had to be taken seriously. It was always the result of careful thought and thorough knowledge. This applies especially to the book, which presents the full development of ideas about how to improve studio education and bring it and the profession closer, a goal dear to Tom's heart, reflecting who he was. It is a thoughtfully sophisticated, superbly reasoned and clearly expressed account of how architects approach design. It makes explicit what is typically left implicit or obfuscated. It challenges the reader, student, or teacher to think hard, clearly and explicitly about what is being said and advocated, and about the nature of the evidence used. Ultimately, that is what education, as opposed to training, is all about. We're indebted to Amos for those very clear and wise observations. Numerous, over 220 articles, conferences, chapters and papers. Tom started writing for Architecture Australia from about 1959, only a few years after graduating. His first piece was titled Functionalism. But most articles until the early 70s focused on art and craft criticism and reviews. There were approximately 50 articles, with some film reviews as well, including one that caught my eye, Barbarella Does Her Thing. After Tom was appointed to the craft board of the Australia Council in 1973, he stopped writing art and craft pieces. And I'm only guessing, but this perhaps was to avoid potential conflict of interest with the art world. He very much enjoyed his time on the board. This opportunity to mix with arts and craft people strengthened his already healthy interest and underpinned his advocacy for a balance between art and technology in his writings about architecture. He then focused more on architectural subjects, mainly critical reviews of buildings, human environment subjects, the nature of architectural practice and design method, but even one titled Supervision, Inspection and Quality Control, 1974. As far back as 1963, he wrote about architectural education and the teaching of design in 1968, subjects he returned to throughout his life and obviously the essence of his final book. He wrote over 160 articles for Architecture Australia and numerous for Architectural Review in the UK. He also published several articles in Architecture and Art and in the Architectural Science Review. Most of his articles until the late 80s were scholarly commentary on ideas, situations and things where he brought his unique perspective based on wide breadth and deep knowledge to bear. He often gave observations and interpretations about research and ideas from others, in a sense, translating such material for a wider audience. It was late in his career that Tom engaged more in original empirical research, mainly relating to design management and to perception and aesthetics. Tom loved writing, not only scholarly and philosophical pieces, but also stories for kids. Louise Cox recalls a wonderfully funny one about a hippopotamus in the bath. Editorship of Architecture Australia for the decade of the 1980s. His editorial writings gained a reputation for their wit and seriousness, their rationality, and their capacity to pare down the topic to its essentials. He could capture your thinking, at least mine, in the first paragraph or so, with a thoughtfully positioned proposition that you accepted or rejected. If you accepted even partially, then the clarity and structure of the rational argument that followed would leave you with little room for a different conclusion. His challenge to the orthodox focused on the architectural profession's myths about itself. His editorials showed the independence of his mind and the strength of his character in challenging conventions. An image of a tall man with glasses riding a bicycle through a paddock full of cows, sacred ones, tickling them as he passed by, I thought might be an appropriate cover for his final book. But we have instead a very elegant and coherent cover. I wrote this in the obituary for Tom in 1998. For those of you who were there at the book launch last week, Michael Kenniger aptly said that reading Tom's editorials was like taking a cold shower. You couldn't avoid paying attention. As also was mentioned by Michael, important milestones and advances that Tom brought during his time as editor of Architecture Australia were the publishing of the national awards, but also, and very significantly, the initiation of the annual discourse series, which, as Michael restated last week, the discourse series provided a research outlet for academics as well as encouraging the quality of scholarship and discussion about architecture. It was ahead of its time and unfortunately suffered from insufficient contributions, and it only lasted a few years. On criticism. For this piece I'm indebted to Hoogman and Paul Hoogman and Naomi Stead. Naomi is at the University of Queensland, and they wrote this in 2004. Tom's, essays on criticism remain as valid and insightful today as they were then. Heath's editorial on 5 traps of architectural discourse of March 1982 is a gem and opens thus. There are no doubt, so this is now Tom, there are no doubt those who would argue that the careless use of words is the main enemy of reasoned talk about architecture. Newspeak, fuzz phrases, buzzwords, and the insidious acronym do much harm. But the harm that they do is aesthetic rather than structural. It is in the fine old fallacies of reasoning which have been with us for millennia and show as little sign of going away as the termite, which really brings down the house of intellect. Here then, with apologies to Ruskin and Philip Johnson, is a little florigium of poisonous weeds, the 5 traps of architectural discourse. These 5 traps are the trap of definition, the trap of poetry, the objective-subjective trap, reductionism or oversimplification, and the trap of relativism. Go to the original sources. I urge you to read more. On aesthetics, Tom wrote at least 14 pieces that I could find on aesthetics. His copper industry scholarship, I mentioned earlier, of 1975, was titled Environmental Aesthetics, the State of the Art. But he had published earlier papers on the subject from 1968, including one imaginative title for a book chapter, Should We Tell the Children About Aesthetics, or Should We Let Them Find Out in the Street? A lovely title. This was in Cantor and Lee, The Psychology of the Built Environment. Porteous, in 1996, in his book on environmental aesthetics, said of Tom's chapter, I love this bit, the activist Heath reviewed a vast amount of research which demonstrated that aesthetic appearance is a valid factor in people's reaction to both indoor and outdoor environments. Heath added that architects and planners have tended to avoid the word aesthetics, preferring pseudo-scientific terms such as environmental quality. But as aesthetics seems to be a basic need, we will have to become brave enough to say aesthetics in front of the children. During the 1990s, with fellow academics, the architect planner, and the late Bill Lim, and environmental psychologist Sandy Smith, Tom undertook empirical research into the aesthetic concept of complexity in relation to tall building facades. This work confirmed that procedures in place for calculating complexity were validated by perceptual response, a finding that advanced knowledge in aesthetics. After his death, this work was published in 2 papers, one titled The Complexity of Tall Building Facades in the Journal of Architecture and Planning Research, and we have the editor here in Andrew Seidel, as well as a second paper titled Tall Buildings and the Urban Skyline, the Effects of Visual Complexity on Preference. And this was published in the journal Environment and Behaviour. And you can see the little note there. CPEN made this T-shirt in limited edition and in very fine print at the bottom of the images are these words, some buildings are more equal than others. And I'm the proud owner of one of those that Tom gave me. On theory, I might add, and ideology. This is Tom. Theory derives from the Greek theros, a spectator. Theory thus has the meaning of an overview of some topic. It has also acquired the sense of a scheme of ideas. This latter sense is better conveyed by the word ideology. In this brief introduction, this was to a lecture he gave in the 1994 colloquium that I referred to earlier, 96 colloquium I referred to earlier. I shall explore the tension between these senses of theory. Ideology is an explicit theory governed by fantasy thinking or illusion, whose purpose is to legitimate certain practices. Ideology, like explicit theory, influences practice. It inhibits learning by reinforcing or excluding patterns of action, such as ornament is crime, express the structure. Both are architectural slogans which exemplify the ill effects of ideology. Architectural theory in general has the character of ideology. The practice justified is usually, in effect, a certain style, such as the modern movement, or deconstruction, which was the rage. No wonder that certain architectural writers have found common ground with deconstructionist critics. They share the sophistic notion of theory as a kit of rhetorical tricks with which to dazzle and deceive. He never minced his words. You knew what he was on about. There is much to be done, Tom says, in developing critical theories of function and aesthetics and method and their connection to design outcomes. Theory and cats. Tom goes on in the same lecture. I shall consider three kinds of theory: implicit theory, explicit theory, and critical theory. Many cats have theories of door opening. For example, that if you stare fixedly at a door in the presence of humans, it will open. The cat's theory is more reliably effective than many human implicit theories, which don't help much when things go wrong. That is, when we apply implicit theory beyond its scope. Then we can either repeat the behaviour or engage in displacement activities, such as praying, swearing, or in the case of cats, and also in the case of humans, grooming. Head scratching is a residual form of grooming activity. I love that bit. Tom's retirement. At his retirement in 1995, faculty colleagues of Tom's presented him with a sculpture, as well as an original Spooner lithograph from about 1840, which incidentally was the year that his great-great-uncle signed the Treaty of Waitangi. The Spooner, this William Spooner, not to be confused with a later William Spooner, after whom Spoonerisms are named, wherein inadvertently beginning letters are transposed in linked words, such as when Spooner offered a toast to the queer old Dean instead of the dear old Queen. We've all heard Spoonerisms. The title of the lithograph was Heath's Oddity Number 32. I've found several other in searching lithographs at Christie's sales and so forth, and there are other oddities with other numbers. I couldn't find any other Heath ones, but nevertheless, this was titled Heath's Oddity Number 32. And in the lithograph, two tall and refined gentlemen with bow ties discuss the meaning of physiognomy. I say, Bates, what is physiognomy? Physiognomy. Why? If you look at a person's physiognomy and you are a physiognomist, you will see their physiognomy. You'll see what it is, and then you will know their physiognomy. That was the caption. I think Tom enjoyed that. Tom's cat bronze sculpture, 1995. You can see it in the Tom Heath Gallery down the other end. We talked to Tom about some way to commemorate his leadership, and we thought of a portrait or something like that. And he wouldn't have a bar of anything like that. So he gave us no clues, so we had to go and dream up something, and this is what we dreamt. This elegant cat, commissioned from artist Frank Lambert, and in recognition of cats in Tom's theory lectures. That's the essence of it. It was presented at his retirement. There were two made, one presented to Tom and one kept for the school, so that it sort of serves the purpose that a portrait might otherwise serve. It remains in the school, but probably as a mystery to many. I'm not sure. Tom posthumously was inducted into the Design Institute of Australia Hall of Fame. You can go to the website and see his entry. I won't read much of what they say there. We've covered already in the talk this evening. Architecture's turn. Andrew Seidel wrote in the foreword to the book, Tom believed it was now architecture's turn to begin the movement from practice-based profession and discipline to an evidence/research and knowledge-based one. Tom believed the slow evolutionary process had begun, and he wanted to be one to leave a lasting contribution to such glacial, hasty events. Yes. As we've seen from this short overview of Tom's contribution to knowledge, it was significant. We heard what Amos Rappaport said. It is clear that anything Tom said had to be taken seriously. It was always the result of careful thought and thorough knowledge. Tom never showed signs of being perplexed, but he did perceive it in others and devoted his life to remedies. Tom, private, reserved and modest, a good conversationalist with a touch of wit and humour, fine memory and erudition, but with no place for sentiment. Those are the words written in the eulogy to Mitchell, and how apt that we borrow them and reapply them to Tom, I think. I'll add, a thoughtful architect, caring educator, astute commentator on the profession, perceptive critic, keen observer of art and life, an intellectual and urbane gentleman, a true contemporary Renaissance man. In a short note to C-Pen, shortly before his death, he wrote under the heading of trivia, no speeches, no funeral. Typical of Tom. He had his own way of doing things, especially departing from life's stage. Oh, don't need that. And that concludes my talk on Tom. Thank you for your attendance.